and especially to... Good evening, everybody, and especially to those who are watching us from a great distance. It's amazing how in these days we can broadcast all over the place, and thank you for joining us. I want to introduce this evening's speaker, who is Professor Wendell McConnaha, and his expertise is in doctors of the 19th century, Scottish doctors who travelled to and became explorers. They might have gone to help with medical cases or illnesses in different parts, but they ended up becoming explorers because doctors are very inquisitive. So I hope you enjoy this evening's talk. Wendell, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. What I want to talk to you about this evening There we go. What I want to talk to you about this evening is sponsored by the John Ray Society, but so that there's no misunderstanding, it's not specifically about John Ray and his exploration. What I'm going to talk about is factors or a series of factors that came together that caused both William Balfour Baikie, as well as John Ray, as well as 70 other medical explorers who had the same background. And I want to talk to you about the research that I made that discovered why this came to be, why they only operated during that 100-year period, and what the factors were that caused them to cease to exist at the end of the 100 years. So in 2022, I published a book about William Balfour Baikie, and you're all aware, also a native of Kirkwall. Baikie was Scot by birth. He had his training at in medical school at Edinburgh University. He became a Royal Navy surgeon. And at the end of that time, he became a naturalist explorer. And I started looking at the factors that caused him to go in this direction. Why did he choose to travel around the world rather than stay and practice medicine at a hospital or a clinic in Scotland? And as I was looking, I started looking at other explorers from that same period. And one of the first ones that I looked at was John Ray. And as you're all well aware, John Ray is also an Orcadian. He's Scot by birth, took his training at Edinburgh, went to work for Hudson's Bay and became a surgeon and explorer for the Hudson Bay. It was a situation where he could have done anything, but again, chose to be an explorer rather than be someone in medicine. As I continued to look, I was trying to determine if they were just two of a kind, or if they were emblematic of a much larger group that had exactly the same background and ended up in exactly the same trade. What I discovered, I found interesting in that if you look at the graph on the board, in between 1815 and 1915, it was called the British Imperial Century. And this is the period that I looked at specifically. This is the period when both Ray and Baikie were active. Ray, slightly older, graduated from Edinburgh earlier than Baikie, but Baikie graduated in 1846, which was about in the middle of this particular group. In addition, at that time, the population of England, or the population of Scotland, was 20% the size of the population of England. Yet when I looked at the explorers from that period, over 60% of the explorers were Scottish. When I looked further, I found that over 70 of these Scottish individuals fit exactly the same profile as Baikie and Ray. So all of a sudden I began to wonder as a researcher, have I stumbled on something that is bigger than just these two Orcadians? Is this something that happened to a large group of people? And if so, why? What were the factors? What happened during that 100 years that caused this to take place? What I found was that these doctors had something in common. First of all, they were Scot by birth. Second, they did their education in Scotland at one of the Scottish medical schools. Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Glasgow, or St. Andrews were all in operation during this time, but the graduates from Edinburgh University outnumbered those from the other three by a ratio of almost 9-1. So again, it was not unique that Ray and Baikie did their medical training at Edinburgh. They were in the vast majority of these 70 explorers that went out at that particular time. I started looking at what could have happened to cause all these people to have the same vocation and the same training and the same background and the same results. And I found that there were shared events across this time that all of them benefited from. The first was the Acts of Union, and even though it was in 1707, well ahead of the British imperial century, I'll talk in a second about why it was so important to the group. Also, the Scottish Enlightenment, which was 1740, 1760 in that range, along to 1820. And the question is, again, what sort of impact did that have and why were these people created? The third event that I'll talk about was the advent of a complete change in the way Scotland prepared their doctors. Not how they prepared them from before, they were always quite innovative, but how the preparation suddenly was completely different from what you would find in English or Irish universities. So first, the merger of England and Scotland in the Acts of Union took the Parliament of Scotland and moved them to London. All of a sudden, the two parliaments were merged, and it was the United Kingdom of Great Britain, not two separate entities ruled by the same king. This had a major impact on the medical explorers because all of a sudden options that were only open to people from England were now open to people from Scotland as well. So as John Ray in the Hudson's Bay Company, East India Company was another example of a joint stock company that benefited from the Acts of Union, as well as the military, specifically the Royal Navy. Within probably 20 to 30 years of the passage of the Acts of Union, Scotsmen dominated every one of those organizations. By far the largest percentage. Places like the East India Company, over 80% of their doctors were actually Scottish trained. There was even a larger percentage of people in Hudson's Bay that were of this background. And in fact, at that point, almost 70% of the employees of Hudson's Bay were not just Scottish, they were Orcadian. So when Queen Anne created the Kingdom of Great Britain, it moved the upper echelon of Scottish society, the people who had been parliamentarians in Scotland, to London. And when they left, this was the upper echelon as far as Scottish society was concerned. And these were the people that were the movers and shakers within that particular time. But what it didn't do, in fact, what it specifically forbade, was that the Scottish church, the law, the practice of law, and the education system would by mandate remain exclusively Scottish. It would not change. So what happened was leaders from the church, the lawyers, and leaders from the university suddenly emerged to fill the vacuum that had been created by the parliamentarians going to London. And these became the people who were now the leaders of Scottish society. This was in about, as I say, 1740, 1760 in that particular era. And when they got together, they started looking at the Scottish Enlightenment. And the Scottish Enlightenment was a factor that was almost exclusively within the cities. And it was almost exclusively within the lowlands and did not impact the highlands nearly as much. But during that time, the Scottish Enlightenment would begin to merge and develop things like pre-collegiate education, pre-university education. They already had an extremely strong educational program, universal education for boys at that particular time, but this enhanced that even more. So you had people like Baikie and Ray coming out of this system where every boy in Scotland was trained as if they were going to university, which was so unique. If you think about Cambridge, Trinity, Oxford, these were universities that were open to the upper echelon of society. Scotland was looking at sons of farmers, sons of craftsmen, sons of merchants, who were also equally prepared. So now you've got a group of these people from the working or middle class who are now being trained as, in many cases, doctors. So you've got someone that's been used to work their entire life. In Ray's case, you've read the stories about his hunting and fishing and growing up with the tenants that his father supervised. And this is a situation where he was now trained in a medical profession. So there was this combination, as we talked briefly earlier, there was this combination of people who have this sturdiness, this entrepreneurial spirit, this willingness to travel, coupled with the fact that jobs in Scotland at that particular time were not as plentiful as they would be. Remember, you're turning out all these doctors, but they were turning out so many doctors that there wasn't places for them to practice. So turning to exploration, in Ray's case, Hudson Bay, and Baikie's case, the Royal Navy, was a perfect extension of what they needed to do. So you now had a universal education where boys from all levels could get the same sort of education. So they went to the universities, and the universities at that point were also changing. If you look at the universities in Scotland at that particular time, their tuition was 1/20th of what it was at either Oxford or Cambridge. It was a situation where, especially in Edinburgh, because Edinburgh was the only university that was started by the city council and not by a church. Trinity, Oxford, Cambridge, St. Andrews, Glasgow, and Aberdeen were all started initially by the Catholic Church, and then after the Reformation became Church of England or Church of Scotland. Edinburgh was open to all classes, all economic levels, and all religions from the start. So Edinburgh, even though the Scottish Enlightenment affected all the cities, and the Enlightenment affected all the universities, Edinburgh quickly emerged as the leader of the Scottish Enlightenment, both as a university and as a city. Although the university as a whole was, in every sense, transformed, it was also a situation where the greatest transformation took place in the medical school itself. I mentioned earlier the Edinburgh City Council having control over the university, which was very unique. But what was also unique is at this point you had people being trained to be physicians or surgeons. And there was a huge gap between the two as far as how they were treated societal, and also how they were treated as far as the preparation that they did. So you had the Academy of Surgeons and you had the physicians. But because the surgeons were also controlled by the Edinburgh City Council, there was collaboration. So if you were Baikie or you were Ray and you were going to study and you wanted to study anatomy, you could take anatomy through the College of Surgeons. If you wanted to study humanities, you could study humanities through Edinburgh Medical School. And there was constant transformation. Oftentimes the anatomy classes would have more people from the university than they did from the surgical class. So there was this great collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, this was all done without regard to wealth, social status, or religion. The other thing that happened exclusively in Edinburgh was there was a new curriculum. There were courses in humanities. There were biological, physical, and natural sciences that were part of the program. And this is at a time when Oxford and Cambridge were described as programs of cutting and curing. In other words, all they taught was anatomy and all they taught was surgery. And they taught it exclusively through lecture. People studying to be doctors never worked in dissection, never worked in any sort of clinical setting. Anatomy and surgical techniques In Edinburgh and in the other, and specifically in Glasgow, but to a lesser extent, St. Andrews and Aberdeen, were taught through dissection of cadavers. They also developed the first teaching hospital. And it was a situation where you actually got a chance to work with real patients, which was never done. You could also get your medical degree in 4 years at Edinburgh, a typical program if you were allowed to study medicine or even chose to study medicine. Remember, Oxford and Cambridge, these were people that were going out to inherit their family's fortune. So there wasn't really a lot of emphasis to study medicine. But if they did, the program at Oxford and Cambridge could take up to 12 years. And again, at almost 5 times the cost of tuition that you'd have in Scotland. Having discovered all of this, it led to my writing of Losing Sight of the Shore. And this was sort of a summary of the research that I had done. And I decided to break the book into 3 areas. First, I looked at what I've just been talking about, the characteristics and factors that led to this group being created. The second thing I did was I looked at 5 specific explorers. And remember, there were over 70 that I could have chosen. But I picked 5. And one of the 5 I picked was John Ray. And I picked John Ray for a number of reasons, not the least of which was having done all the research on Baikie. I think this is our 4th or 5th trip to Kirkwall since 1994. And so I had some familiarity. He was the first one that I saw fit the pattern, and I really wanted to follow up and see what the connection was. And then, as I said earlier, in the final part, I looked at why they ceased to exist. What happened during these 100 years that created them? But more importantly to me as a researcher, why did they cease to exist after 1915? When I looked at characteristics, I saw that Scots were from working or middle class backgrounds. We've talked about the merger and employment options that took place that were not available before 1707. We talked about the strong universal education, and then we talked about the unique preparation of medical schools. So I started looking at who would I pick to write about. And I decided these were the criteria, the first 4, and I'll talk a little bit more about the 5th. First of all, I picked people that explored. Remember, this was a 100-year period. So I picked explorers that covered the entire gamut. So some of them you'll see when I talk about them were from the early part of the British imperial century. Some were clear at the end of the British imperial century. I also wanted to have people that had explored different parts of the world. So I didn't talk about Baikie other than as an introduction in his book at all. But I had somebody from Africa, so I started looking at other places. And so John Ray being in the Arctic, William Spires Bruce being in Antarctica, I started looking at other places that hadn't been represented at that point. They all explored for different reasons, and we'll talk about this a little bit in a little more detail. But there are reasons during this that changed. They started with things like geographic exploration, where they're just looking for trade routes and settling countries, all the way up to the end, which you'll see, where they were exploring just for the sake of science. There was no reason to go to a particular place, but they wanted to know more, so they could do that. And finally, I looked at those that kept journals. And John Ray, you're all familiar with the journals that he kept and so forth. But it's very important to me, since obviously there's no first person I can talk to who was alive during the time that these happened. So I needed to get an idea from what they had written. And it allowed me, in effect, to let them tell their own story. And so I incorporated a lot of what were in their individual journals that they had written. So these are the 5 people that I picked. The first is Archibald Mingus, and you can see that he was very early in the period of exploration, lived from 1754 to 1842. Mingus had started in the Royal Navy, like Baikie, and he had been very active, a military surgeon during the War of 1812. And at the end of that, he was actually trained as a botanist. His father was a botanist, and he ended up working first at the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. And then when he got into the military, he still continued to collect wherever he went. He did 2 round-the-world tours after he leaving the Royal Navy. He collected hundreds of plant species, including the monkey puzzle tree, which he introduced back into the UK. And he really is credited with developing the concept of the British garden. He was the one that sort of designed everything from what plants to put into the layout. I talked earlier, and this is a good time to bring it up, for whatever reason, and I hadn't known this until I started researching them, but for whatever reason, each of these 5 people ran into some serious issues, either with their sponsor, with the general public, or in some cases even the law. So it made it kind of interesting for me as a researcher to look at this. So in Mingus's case, he was on his 2nd round the world tour. He had just collected seeds from the monkey puzzle tree, which I found interesting. He actually discovered at a banquet. They were on the table being served as nuts to eat. And he thought they were very interesting, hadn't seen them, not knowing anything about what they were, picked up a half dozen of them, took them back, put them on a ship in planters, and when he got back, he had the first monkey puzzle trees introduced into the UK, which is now, I think it's against the law if you have a garden and don't have a monkey puzzle tree. But this is what he intended to do. On his 2nd voyage, when he was coming back, he'd been away for 3 years. He was with a Captain Vancouver, who was a very famous captain at that particular point. Vancouver Island and the city of Vancouver in Canada are named after him. And on his way back, he had been directed by Joseph Banks, who was his sponsor, to not give the information that he'd collected or the plants that he'd collected to anybody other than Joseph Banks or the Admiralty. Captain Vancouver required that each of his officers, including Mingus, turn over all of the notes to him so that he could write the narrative of the voyage himself. So now Mingus is in a bit of a pickle. He can follow what Banks, his sponsor, told him to do, or what his captain told him to do. And he chose Banks. Vancouver immediately put him in irons, threatened him with court-martial upon return, and when he got back to London was not even allowed to leave the ship. He got a hold of Banks, who went to his benefit and got him released, but Banks was quite upset with Mingus because he blamed the whole thing on him. But he said, all will be forgiven if you give me the information so that I can publish my stuff ahead of Vancouver's. Dad was a crofter. He didn't have any money. He had to go back into the Royal Navy to earn a living. And when he did, it delayed the publication. Banks never forgave him. Even though he was less than 40 years old when he finished his 2nd voyage, he was never given the opportunity to do another voyage the rest of his life, and was basically blackballed by the scientific community. Lived to be 82, but it was all on land from that point back. The 2nd person I looked at was Sir John Kirk. John Kirk started again as a Navy physician, also graduated, spent time in the Crimean War as a doctor, and while he was there, got the bug to travel. Ended up traveling with Livingston in Africa for the first 5 years. Livingston passed away, and John Kirk took over Livingston's work in order to eradicate slavery, and that became his lifelong reason for exploration. He was originally on Zanzibar, and while on Zanzibar, he spent the next 20 years there, but while on Zanzibar, he worked to get slavery eradicated throughout East Africa. Remember, at that time, since 1807, the West Atlantic Squadron and so forth had taken care of slavery, or tried to, on the Atlantic side, but the Arab gathering of slaves was still going strong, and so that's what he was working with, was trying to solve the East African slave trade. He was successful, but during that time, this was also when Germany was trying to build up their colonial empire. And the Kaiser in Germany contacted the Prime Minister in the UK and said they were quite upset with Sir John and said, we want him removed. Britain did not want to alienate the Germans at that time. It didn't work out really well later on, but they didn't want to stop Germany at that time, So even though he just eradicated slavery for half a continent, he was recalled and dismissed from the Foreign Service. However, he was recognized as the top expert in Africa, and when they formed a commission a little while later of delegates from a variety of countries, they asked him to head it. And in doing so, he wrote the treatise that ended up stopping slavery throughout the entire continent. And even his fellow attendees gave him credit for it. He was knighted on 3 different occasions and ended up living to a ripe old age. He was the last of the ones that I covered, not dying until 1922. Sir Charles Wavell Thompson was toward the end, and we'll talk a little bit about the reasons for exploration, but he was one of the first ones that did science strictly for science. So his area were the oceans, not a particular continent. And he led the Challenger expedition, which spent 3 years traveling around the world studying the ocean. The top, the waves, the bottom, everything in between. Up to that point, the whole study of the ocean looked at the currents on top, and they looked at whatever happened to come up in a fisherman's net and trying to identify. He dredged the bottom, he took temperature readings, he took sounding, he discovered the Mariana Trench. He was extremely valuable. He was knighted for his work and ended up creating the science of oceanography. He's actually credited for that becoming a legitimate science. It didn't even appear in the dictionaries before his tour. When he got back he set up the Oceanography Institute in Edinburgh and ended up starting to write the results. It ended up being 19 volumes. It ended up being 50 volumes and took 19 years to write. It was decided that this was the largest scientific effort that had ever been undertaken. But Thompson was never a well man, and when he came back, he tried to resume his University of Edinburgh duties, plus do the writing, plus do everything he had to do, and it weakened him, and he died at 54. Other people had to actually finish the 50 volumes. The next person also has some Orcadian connections. William Spires Bruce, 1867 to 1921, is a little bit different from the others. I hedged a bit on this one. He was actually born in London to Scottish parents, but I felt justified because 2 of his grandparents were from the Orkney Islands, so I felt justified in doing that. He was also one of the ones that was actually let down by the scientific community, unlike an individual person. During this time, you looked at people like Scott and like Shackleton, who were in the news all the time. If you were an explorer at this particular date, around 1900, it was the Arctic and the Antarctic that you were looking at, and that's what you wanted to do. Each of those, I believe, Shackleton, I think, did 3 polar expeditions. Scott did 2. Bruce did 13. He was twice to Antarctica, 11 times to the Arctic. He led the Scotia expedition that did the first permanent settlement in Antarctica as a science station that's still in use today. He also determined, because at that point they weren't sure that Antarctica was even a continent. They thought it could be a series of islands. They thought, there were a number of things, because they'd already discovered that the Arctic was not a continent, that it was an ice shelf. But he discovered the boundaries. However, he was initially offered the opportunity to be the naturalist or explorer for a Royal Geographical Society expedition that was going out in 1902. And he'd applied earlier, and they just ignored his application. And so when they asked him if he would do it this time, I'm from a Scottish background. I'm from the Clan Robertson. And I can say this with all the pride. Scots can sometimes be stubborn. And so he said, no, I asked you before, you turned me down, so no, I'm not interested any longer. Instead, I'll do my own expedition. So he did the expedition. He financed his own ship, which he immediately named the Scotia, which did not fly out under the Union Jack. It flew out under the flag of St. Andrew. He picked an entire Scottish crew, including all the scientists, even the Scotsmen who were running his ship. He would not put an Englishman on board. When he got back, after what was viewed as an amazing scientific expedition, a success in every regard, he received accolades from scientists in both countries, both England and Scotland. However, he did not necessarily receive plaudits from the Royal Geographical Society. In fact, from 1857 to 1968, every person who participated in a polar expedition that came from the UK or one of the colonies was given the Polar Medal. Not one member of his crew was given the Polar Medal, and you may say, why? Well, because the nomination comes from the Royal Geographical Society in London. So they said no. He also, and you know this to be true for Ray, which will be next, but you also know that he was nominated for knighthood. I mean, again, Scott got knighthood, Shackleton got a knighthood. This guy had 13 voyages and was nominated, I think, 7 times and passed over every one of them. And died in his 50s in Edinburgh, basically forgotten by everybody in the scientific community. Last but certainly not least, John Ray, who you're all familiar with, ended up leaving here after Edinburgh, went to through Hudson Bay, was initially there almost by accident. The ship was frozen in. They started late, they got back late, and he ended up spending a time there. The governor of the trading post, the Moose Factory, which is where he was stationed at the time, asked him to become the surgeon, but he'd promised his mother and father he would come back, so he said no. Well, at the end of the year, when he went back to Moose Factory to keep the appointments that he needed to do before coming back, he found out that the governor there had actually contacted his mother without him knowing, and his mother said, "It's a job, take it." And so he said he would take it for 2 years, and he was there for 20. He ended up with a couple of really important discoveries. At this point, the Franklin expedition had gone out for the Royal Navy to actually look by ship for the Northwest Passage. This was extremely important at that time. Everyone knew that there was a way to get across, and this was before the Panama Canal, so the only option was to go around one of the capes to get to the other side to do trade with the Far East. And they said if we could just find a way across Canada, that would make things a lot easier, and we would be able to get the leg up certainly on the other countries if Britain controlled it. And it was going through British Canada at that point, so it looked like it was a good opportunity. Franklin went out with 2 ships, and when he went to explore, both ships got frozen in. And the last he was seen was when he disappeared going into the entrance through one of the bays into the center of Canada. And the Admiralty, and Ray often worked either for the Royal Navy or for the Admiralty, in addition to being ongoing employed by the Hudson Bay Institute. And they had sent 55 separate expeditions out to try to find what had happened to Franklin. Well, by this time, it's 9 years after they disappeared. And everybody now had assumed that had they lived, they would have made it out and somebody would have known about it. So they said it's no longer a need to find them and rescue them. It's now we need to find out what happened to them so that we don't make the same mistake again. Also, they said while you're there, continue with the work that Franklin was going to do and look for the Northwest Passage. So whenever Ray would go out for about a 7-year period, whenever he would go out, he would have these 2 things that he was supposed to do. Look for the Northwest Passage, but also continue to look for any word about what happened to Franklin and the 2 ships' crews. The first thing that he discovered, The Northwest Passage had already been located from the Pacific side and also from the Atlantic side. But there was a gap in the middle of northern Canada that no one could figure out how would you get the ship between there. There didn't seem to be any rivers. They were frozen solid and wouldn't allow any kind of transportation at that time. And so the people had almost given up. Ray discovered that there was a period during the winter where a rather protected river could still be sailed. There was ice, but it was thin enough. It was what he called new ice. There was thin ice that he could go through and make it. And it was just a theory at that time. But 50 years later, Roald Amundsen in 1909 sailed through using exactly the route that Ray had discovered and proved the theory correct. So Ray had actually discovered the missing link in the Northwest Passage. That exploration was enough to earn him the gold medal from the Royal Geographical Society for his work. Less than a year after he discovered the Northwest Passage, he also discovered the fate of the Franklin expedition. Some Inuit had come in to trade with him, and he saw that one of them had a hat band that obviously had come from a Royal Navy officer. And so he started talking and he started telling the story. And although he never made a visual sighting of any of the bodies, he learned from these natives that the men had tried to walk out. Within a 2-year period, all of them had died from a variety of reasons. Either they starved to death, they froze to death, and that Franklin had been among the earliest to die. They also presented some artifacts that they had. And from the artifacts, they could see that there were knives and so forth. And the Inuit said there was also evidence that the men had become so desperate at the end that they had turned to cannibalism. And understandable. I mean, if you're there 2 years and you're not able to hunt, you're not able, and so they'd turned to cannibalism. So Ray, now having discovered the Northwest Passage and discovered the fate of the Franklin expedition, returned to England with the information. He sent a note, or actually a memo, to the Admiralty in which he explained everything, including the speculation of cannibalism. He also sent a report to the Times, but didn't have the stuff in it about the cannibalism. Somehow, the day after, the Times actually reported in their front page edition about the cannibalism. And this was Victorian England. Franklin, who was a really odd choice to lead the expedition anyway, because he was well into his 60s and had had a number of failures, had an extremely powerful and influential wife. And Lady Franklin decided that her life's goal would be to protect her husband's reputation and to destroy Ray's, because the way that she could prove that Franklin's group had not turned to cannibalism, because what Victorian would do that, was to make sure that everybody thought Ray was a liar, or at best uninformed. She had some powerful allies, including Charles Dickens, who wrote letters on his behalf. Ray had a lot of skills, but was not up to the ability to take on verbally someone of Dickens' stature. And as a result, he came off second best in some of the writing. He eventually got the reward. There was a 10,000 pound reward for someone who found the fate of Franklin. It was delayed for over a year because of the pressure that Lady Franklin put on, but eventually he did get the money. But meanwhile, Hudson's Bay, who he'd worked for over 20 years, said, well, with all this controversy, we're going to let you go for a while too. So he lost his job. Eventually he got it back, but he never really forgave the two groups that he had worked with and for what had happened to him. As you're all aware, buried in the cemetery behind St. Magnus with both he and Baikie's memorial inside. If you're not aware, unlike Ray, Baikie's actually buried in Sierra Leone, when he died in Africa. So, why did they stop or cease to exist. First of all, as I said earlier, the need for geographic exploration went away. The empire by 1915 was almost at its peak. And so you don't need to go around and discover new lands and look and so forth. They weren't expanding. The naturalists, which were by far the biggest group of the medical explorers, because of the background that they had in science, made them perfect. They could be serving Hudson's Bay as a doctor, or they could be serving the Royal Navy as a doctor, but they could also add exploration or natural history to their repertoire. The naturalists initially thought that every species of plant and animal had been here since created by God. And so if they could just find one of each, they would have all the knowledge of the free world. It would be a situation where they would now have the collection. These are the plants that have always existed. These are the animals. Well, Charles Darwin sort of threw a wrench in that when he wrote On Origin of Species. All of a sudden, the naturalists realized that they could never find one of everything, because by the time they did, there would be millions of things that hadn't been around when they started. So within a very short period of time, after almost 100 years of searching, within a very short period of time, the need for the naturalist explorers went away. With constantly evolving, we don't need you anymore. There were two major events at the end that took care of everybody else. Things like eradication of slavery. With Kirk's work, it was done now. Africa was the last holdout. Places like Brazil and so forth continued to trade in slaves up until about 1908, somewhere in there. But basically, it was done. And if it was still trying to be handled, it was handled now by religious groups or by governments, not by individual explorers like Livingstone or Kirk. But in the same way that the British imperial century started with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it ended with the start of World War I. All of a sudden, the doctors who had been explorers were now needed to be doctors. They were at war. You could no longer have the luxury of serving as ship's surgeon and also then taking care of the exploration duties. Your entire life had to be devoted to treating the people under your care and making sure that the war wounded didn't die. But the final reason is that Scotland had created a completely unique system. They had a system that was universal education regardless of class, regardless of religion, regardless of social status. Edinburgh had become the #1 educational institution in the world. The first 5 medical schools in the United States were founded on the Edinburgh model by graduates of the University of Edinburgh. Everybody knew that that was the only way to train doctors. Clinical practice, teaching hospitals, all this that had been created in Scotland, all of a sudden now was available everywhere. And as it was available now everywhere, there was no need to rely exclusively on Scottish doctors for exploration, because any country that was looking for someone to do that could now get from their own institutions. So the Scottish medical explorers is a situation, and it's a case of the right men at the right time with the right set of circumstances that led them to this point. It would never happen again. It probably could not happen anyplace else except that 100-year history. And when 1915 came around, the need for them ceased to exist. Thank you. And if you have questions, I would be happy to answer them or make things up. Yes?
Just go back to the beginning when you were talking about the factors
Mm-hmm.
all relevant. And almost all of them except the last one about the peculiarity.
Mm-hmm.
Scottish medical education,
Like
that's Scots in general,
Mm-hmm.
which perhaps explains why they are disproportionately
Represented amongst travellers and explorers more generally.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, and particularly the universal education, but I'm just wondering, is there any other profession, vocation that you're aware of that is represented or overrepresented in the same way as medical doctors?
There may be, not that I'm aware of, would be the short answer, but I never give short answers, so I'll give you a longer one. This is a situation where there were so many factors, these three factors that came together, and the timing at which point they came together is what created this window. The other thing that I didn't mention, the reason why it was, during that 100-year period, you had been fighting Napoleon from 1803 to 1815, and then it ended. And then during the next 100 years, with the exception of a brief period of the Crimean War, it was basically the first time of peaceful existence in the UK for a long time before or after. So as a result, you've got the Navy, the largest Navy in the world, needing to find something to do with the ships and men. So they were looking for ways to bring people in, as was Hudson's Bay, as was the East India Company. So as a result, you've got a people with unique preparation at a time when there wasn't available work in their own country, at a time when the country that was sort of their partner in the way England and Scotland emerged needed somebody to fill this void. And so I don't know of any other occupation that was so dominated by a country that was so much smaller than the country it was actually dominating. I mean, if you think about it, 60% of the explorers coming from 20% of the population is an amazing statistic. So I don't know of any other occupation where that would have happened. And it didn't happen, when I say the rest of the world caught up, England was not the rest of the world that caught up in the way they prepared doctors. It was well into the 1900s before Catholics could go to either Oxford or Cambridge. It was well into that particular time before they cut their program back to a point where it was even close in a number of years that Scotland did. You could be a doctor in the Royal Navy after 2 years in Scotland with a special certificate. You could be a fully licensed physician after 4 years. And again, the program because they didn't actually have medical schools on Oxford or Cambridge. They had medical classes, they would take classes, but then they would go to one of the teaching hospitals to actually learn, and they learned by apprenticeship. And in order to do all that, it took 12 years to get through. So first of all, you've got a very elite population who didn't necessarily want or need to be doctors. And second, you had people that didn't want to give up 12 years of their life to something where they'd make less money than if they went home and inherited the house. Mm. Sir.
Wendell, a lot of geological samples. A lot of geological samples were brought back. Was this looked at specially to bring geological items to study?
Yes, there were a number of things that happened during this period. First of all, Victorian England was absolutely mad about science. And it would be very unusual to have a house, even people that had very little financial wealth, that wouldn't have a fern cabinet or wouldn't have a terrarium or wouldn't have a shell collection or wouldn't have a rock collection. Everybody was into natural history, again, because they thought, just get one of each and we'll have the whole thing solved. And so there was a great deal of that. This was also the time that the Botanic Gardens really took off. This was a time when places like the British Museum and others became really institutions that became not simply ways to really charm the public, but it actually became centers where you would do pure scientific research. And people like Joseph Banks at Kew Gardens would send ships out to bring back specimens specifically for what he called economic botany, because economic botany was looking at plants or minerals or whatever that you could bring back that would benefit the empire as a whole and become economically valuable. He also then invented something called economic botany, which sort of mirrored this. But he got the idea, and of course King George the third at that time He and Banks were collaborators up until 1820 on this development. But when they would come back, there was a lot of wasted time. And sometimes they would bring things back like pineapple that could never be grown in England except in a hothouse. So they started looking at different ideas, and they created what was called the hub and spoke system. So the hub was Q, so it still filtered everything, or tried to, in and out. But the spokes became botanic gardens that were scattered all over the world, mostly in places that used to be the property of the East India Company. And so all of a sudden, you started having people bringing pineapple into the Bahamas, but then it also went to Hawaii. It also went to, different places. Or you'd bring in tobacco from someplace, but then it'd end up in their colonies in North America. So you would end up with this economic botany that then was designed, and another reason why a lot of explorers were in existence. But again, that went away because as soon as they did the hub and spoke system, they would take these same people that had been gathering stuff on the ships and put them in charge now of this botanic garden at a remote site. But yes, there were geological specimens, there were certainly many plant specimens, and it was all done for the enhancement of the empire.
Thank you.
No, I haven't. Sorry.
Oh, I thought you had your hand up.
Please.
You talked about the examples that you'd used and how they all had challenges, and particularly it seems to me with recognition of their achievements. Do you think the fact that they were Scots is a factor in that? I'm just thinking that perhaps, even though they might have been among the elite of Scotland,
Right.
they did not have the influence and power that those in England did. And Lady Franklin, John Ray,
Exactly.
perfect example.
Yeah, I think, and certainly if you were to ask Bruce, he would say that that was the situation. And I'm reluctant to tell any of you any of the history, but it's a situation where when the parliaments merged, they merged, but in a way that Scotland was always a second-class citizen. Something like 8% of the House of Parliament was Scots, even though 20% of the population was Scottish. So it was a situation where, and again, Bruce was firmly convinced, and I think the evidence would probably prove him correct, but he was firmly convinced that the reason, it wasn't that he was turned down, they just didn't even respond to him. So here's this guy who's already done 11 polar expeditions at that time, who isn't even considered, not to head it, but to be one of the explorers on the next one. So he and others were firmly convinced that it was because there was a prejudice against Scotland. Yes.
You've made the case, using these 5 examples, that Scots-trained doctors were better explorers, were more useful to the British imperial enterprise. But it seems pretty clear that they were also better doctors as well.
Yeah.
Is that a fair comment, do you think?
That's a fair comment. If you get a chance, and I know it's online because that's where I first saw it, but if you get a chance, look at John Kirk. And I think it's called the Group of 7, I'm not sure. But if you look at it, they have the 7 people who he was more closely aligned with during his graduating class. When Baikie graduated from Edinburgh, he was picked as the clinical assistant for the teaching hospital. They picked one person. When Kirk graduated that senior year, they picked all 7 of them because they couldn't decide who to take. There were people like Joseph Lister. There were people that were responsible for discovering how to effectively use things like ether and chloroform. So they were, as students, were revolutionizing the way clinical practice was taking place, and this continued throughout. The list of people coming out of the Enlightenment that were medical people is huge, far more than even the number of people that were the explorers. So yes, they were not simply good explorers. Baikie did the first clinical trial proving that quinine prevented malaria. Up to that point, people would take quinine, and I know I'm not saying it the same way, but quinine in order to cure someone who had, or keep him alive, who had contracted malaria. Baikie decided that it could be used as a prophylactic, and that if you took quinine prior to going into Africa, it could prevent you from getting. And so he conducted he's credited by the Royal Navy as conducting the first clinical trial. And his first exploration of the Niger and Benue rivers, he was on the river for 2 months, gave people a glass of wine with a couple grains of quinine in it in the morning, and repeated it at night. And at the end of the 2 months, returned to Fernando Po without the loss of a single person. This was at a time when the average loss of a European crew going into Africa was in excess of 70%. He didn't lose a person. And his writings about how this happened was later used by Livingston, by Kirk, by others who did the exploration. So yes, they were scientists, they were fantastic clinicians, they were research people, they were every sense of the word. And it all goes back to the training being so substantially different. Whether you're going into medicine or going into exploring was so substantially different than the people south of the border were getting. I thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Fascinating talk. I learned a lot. I hope I can remember it.
Oh,
But I'm sure
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Same background.
Yeah. No, they had witnessed that the procedure worked, so they repeated it. Unfortunately, Baikie did the same. I'm sorry.
As we continue the conversation after we finish. Do you want to take just a sec?
Yeah. Unfortunately, Baikie repeated the experiment the second time, and on his second voyage, and became very disheartened because he started losing people on that one. But it turns out the reason was, if you go to a chemist now and you order Panadol, and you go to another chemist and order Panadol, it's going to be exactly the same. At that point, quinine, which is extracted from tree bark and then turned into crystals, depended on the size of the crystal, depended on the strength of the crystal itself. And so what happened was, Baikie had used 4 grains in his first trial, and it worked perfectly. So he continued to use 4 grains in the second one, and it didn't work perfectly. He started losing people. So he thought maybe the error had been his, and so he got very disheartened and sort of turned away from using it, even though it had worked the first time. When Kirk and Livingston, and they had the benefit of being 20 years later, started using it, and this gets back also, Hugh, to your question that they were also great doctors. Kirk said, well, maybe it's the quinine. Maybe it's not the concept. Maybe it's the strength of the quinine. So he started increasing the dose. If somebody got sick, because they started getting sick on Livingston's expedition too, and if they started getting sick, he just would start increasing the dosage. And he got it up to the point where there were things like ringing in the ears and things like that, where it was almost to an overdose, and then he would back off. And like Baikie and theirs, they didn't lose a person. And had Baikie put more trust in the cure rather than in the drug itself, he would have probably had the same results. So people did learn from it. They then took what he had learned or what he had developed and enhanced it. And quinine became the procedure for preventing malaria all the way up to the start of World War II, when they finally created a synthetic. So yeah.
I have a question online from somebody. Did you notice any trends or patterns in the way that Scottish explorers related to the Indigenous people in the locations they spent time in?
I'm sorry, say once again.
I'll repeat it for you. So we've got, did you notice any trends or patterns in the way that Scottish explorers related to the Indigenous people in the locations that they spent time in?
When I spoke at the end on why everything went away, I said that it was a situation that people were learning in the Scottish way. And to clarify, at that point, the Scottish way referred to not just the medicine, but the educational background and training throughout. So people in law, people in business. There were writers that said it's impossible to go to any section of the world and not come up with a Scotsman who is doing X, Y, or Z in order to succeed. And so everything from business, and if you look at the Scottish Enlightenment, by 1820, they were pretty much controlling everything from economics to business to law. You had people in chemistry, you had people in mathematics, and their influence was across the board. And in some cases, it was a situation where the first person in a particular location was the medical explorer, but that then caused these centers to continue to increase to a point that it was across the board. It was not just medicine.
Thank you. I think that's the questions that we have online. I think that's us finished. Has anyone got any other questions or comments? No. Thank you very much. That was really enjoyable. And thank you for a very interesting talk. Thank you.